Close your eyes and breathe deeply, letting the modern world fade away. Let us travel back to a time when the darkness was held back not by electric grids, but by the soft, sputtering yellow flame of a simple kerosene lamp. Allow the quiet, steady rhythm of this true historical struggle to guide you toward rest. She was an elegant woman of the Gilded Age, her skirt sweeping the floor of McClure's magazine office. Yet she carried a weapon far more dangerous than any gun, a pen dipped in cold, hard truth. Her target was the richest, most powerful man in the world, a titan who controlled 90% of the oil that lit America, greased its machines, and fueled its future. His name was John D. Rockefeller. Her name was Ida Tarbell. And her decade-long hunt for the truth would not just ruin a dynasty, but fundamentally change how America viewed power, wealth, and the very concept of justice. This is the true story of how an unassuming daughter of a ruined Pennsylvania oilman declared war on the Standard Oil Company, becoming the original muckraker, and in doing so, laid the intellectual groundwork for the very laws that would define American free enterprise for the next century.
Part 1. The Genesis of the Golem. The earth in Titusville, Pennsylvania, in the autumn of 1872, smelled of decay and crude wealth. It was a stench that clung to the town like the black film of oil to the water. A sulphurous, sweet, intoxicating stink of sudden, unearned fortune. Ida Minerva Tarbell, barely 15, watched the sky glow not with the sunset, but with the infernal haze of burning natural gas, flared off as waste by the thousands of derricks that peppered the hills. Her father, Franklin Tarbell, a tall, thoughtful man whose hands always smelled faintly of machine oil, stood beside her, his jaw set in a line of weary defeat. "Look at it, Ida," he murmured, his voice tight. "A bonfire of the gods, burning money just to get to the slick stuff beneath." Franklin Tarbell was a man who had loved the oil business in its virtuous youth. He was not a wildcat speculator, but a practical man, a wagon maker who had quickly pivoted to building wooden storage tanks and later the specialized pipes for refining. He had been a successful independent, a man whose word was his bond, one of the thousands who had rushed to Oil Creek in the years after Colonel Drake first struck Rock Oil in 1859. But the industry had changed. The honest chaos of the frontier was curdling into something cold and systematic. The sickness had a name: the South Improvement Company. Ida remembered the day the news first hit their modest home like a thunderclap. It was February of that year. Franklin had stormed into the house, tearing off his coat, his face blotched with fury. "The independents are ruined, Minerva! Ruined by the stroke of a pen!" he had roared to Ida's mother. The South Improvement Company was not a drilling operation. It was a paper construct. Secretly masterminded by a consortium of Cleveland refiners, the chief among them a devout Baptist named John Davidson Rockefeller. It was an audacious conspiracy hatched with the major railroads, the Pennsylvania, the New York Central, and the Erie. The terms, when they became known, were astonishing, a piece of industrial chicanery unprecedented in American history. The railroads had agreed to raise the freight costs for everyone, the independents, the Tarbells, everyone in the oil regions. But then, to the members of the South Improvement Company, Rockefeller's cabal, they would secretly grant massive rebates. Worse, the railroads would pay Rockefeller a drawback on every barrel of oil shipped by his competitors. It was a financial mechanism designed not merely to outcompete, but to actively, systematically bleed his rivals dry. Every shipment Franklin Tarbell made to his buyers in Pittsburgh or New York was a coin dropped directly into Rockefeller's pocket. The goal was simple and chillingly effective. Drive down the price of independent refineries and storage facilities until they were worthless, then buy them for pennies on the dollar. Ida watched her father join the oil war. He attended the mass meetings in the old opera houses, where thousands of enraged oilmen, from roughnecks to respectable refinery owners, swore a collective oath. They would not sell oil to the South Improvement Company. They would not deal with the railroads. They organized a boycott, an embargo that threatened to paralyze the flow of crude that fueled the nation. For a few thrilling weeks, they won. The independent oilmen had spirit, grit, and collective will. The outrage was so immense that the state legislatures and even Congress were forced to investigate. The railroads, fearing true public backlash and the loss of all revenue from the region, finally, temporarily buckled. The South Improvement Company charter was repealed. Franklin Tarbell and his neighbors celebrated. The small, honest businessman had triumphed over the monolithic power of capital. But the celebration was naive, fleeting. John Davidson Rockefeller had learned a critical lesson. A paper company could be killed, but the idea behind it could not. He simply changed his tactics, moving with the stealth and patience of a hunting wolf. He dismantled the South Improvement Company, and in its place he built the Standard Oil Company, a structure bound not by illegal charter, but by interlocking stock ownership and ironclad secrecy. He continued to use the railroads, demanding not just rebates on his own oil, but special rates, sometimes 50% lower than his competitors, because of the sheer overwhelming volume he controlled. If an independent refused to sell to Standard, Rockefeller would simply undercut their prices to the brink of ruin. If a pipeline or storage facility was built to bypass the railroads, he would buy it or build a superior one and then deny its use to everyone else. He used spies, threatened bank managers, and employed a psychological warfare that was both brilliant and utterly immoral. This was the sight that burned itself into Ida Tarbell's consciousness. The slow, systematic strangulation of her community, her father's business, and the very idea of fair play. Franklin Tarbell's business did not vanish in a spectacular ruin. It bled out, day by day, year by year. The honest profits disappeared. The margins shrank to nothing. He would sit by the fire in the evenings, not reading, but staring into the flames, trying to puzzle out the latest rate changes, the newest rumor of a secret deal that had just undercut his last shipment. Ida saw the toll it took on him, the erosion of dignity, the slow replacement of hope with cynicism. Her father was not defeated by a better product, smarter drilling, or superior management. He was defeated by a superior structure of greed, a secret and powerful organization that saw competition not as a healthy engine, but as a cancer to be excised. It planted a seed in the young woman's mind. She did not fully understand the complexities of corporate finance, interlocking directorates, and collateral trust stock, but she understood justice. And she understood that a single powerful figure, a colossus as the papers would later call him, was stealing the future of her town and the honor of her father. She had witnessed the birth of the American trust, and from that moment she was marked to be its destroyer. The Tarbell family's economic decline eventually forced Ida to leave the oil regions. She secured a place at Allegheny College, one of the few places that accepted women at the time. She did not leave with an ambition to be a writer or a crusader. Her degree was in biology, and she dreamed of a life in science. But the specter of Standard Oil, The golem that John Davidson Rockefeller had created followed her, a shadow cast across the whole of the American economy. Her scientific ambition, however, would prove critical. The rigorous, demanding discipline of the lab bench, the absolute necessity of verifiable data, of meticulous observation, of rejecting all assumptions until proven facts accumulated into an undeniable truth, that became her intellectual armor. She would not rely on rumor or sentiment. She would apply the scientific method to the corporate world, dissecting the golem with the cold, unfeeling precision of a surgeon. It would take years, a failed teaching career, a move into editorial work, and a crucial formative period in Paris writing biographical sketches. But in 1894, the ambitious firebrand editor S.S. McClure would coax her back to America, offering her a staff position at his newly launched McClure's Magazine. McClure understood the soul of the new American reader. They were hungry for stories that exposed the real mechanism of their country, the powerful hidden gears grinding beneath the veneer of Gilded Age prosperity.
Part 2. The Hammer of Justice. United States Government versus Standard Oil Company. The years following the publication of Ida Tarbell's magnum opus, The History of the Standard Oil Company, felt like a slow, inexorable tightening of a screw. Her work, compiled and published in book form in 1904, galvanized not just public opinion, but crucially, President Theodore Roosevelt. While Roosevelt had initially used the term muckraker to scold journalists for focusing too much on the negative, he understood that Tarbell had provided the necessary factual artillery for his administration's trust-busting agenda. Roosevelt was a pragmatist. He knew he could not simply wish the great trusts away. He needed to dismantle them through the established legal channels of the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. That law, though often vague and rarely enforced in its first decade, became the legal hammer he would wield. The government's official offensive began in earnest in 1906, when the U.S. government filed suit against the Standard Oil Company of New Jersey, the primary holding company through which Rockefeller controlled his labyrinthine empire. The lawsuit was filed in the Circuit Court for the Eastern District of Missouri. The structure of the Standard Oil Trust. To understand the magnitude of the legal fight, one must grasp the ingenious yet nefarious structure of the Standard Oil Trust. Rockefeller had perfected the art of corporate obfuscation. It wasn't just a single company. It was a vast interlocking web designed to maximize control while minimizing legal liability. The New Jersey holding company, Standard Oil of New Jersey, the defendant in the case, served as the central vault. It legally owned the stock of over 70 subsidiary companies across the nation, which managed everything from oil fields to refineries to pipelines. The control. By creating this centralized ownership structure, Rockefeller and his few key partners, like Henry Flagler and John Archbold, could dictate pricing, production, and shipping decisions for nearly 90% of the entire U.S. oil industry. This structure was designed specifically to bypass state anti-monopoly laws. If a state sued the local Standard Oil refinery, the parent company in New Jersey remained untouched. The government's argument, heavily informed by Tarbell's research, rested on a central claim. Standard Oil was an illegal combination in restraint of trade under the Sherman Act. The core of the accusation was the concept of the unreasonable restraint of trade, arguing that Standard's sheer size and methods were not the result of healthy competition, but of predatory practices. The secret railroad rebates, the use of espionage, the localized price wars to destroy competitors, and the creation of the holding company itself. The government's argument, heavily informed by Tarbell's research, rested on a central claim. Standard Oil was an illegal combination in restraint of trade under the Sherman Act.
The core of the accusation was the concept of the unreasonable restraint of trade, arguing that Standard's sheer size and methods were not the result of healthy competition, but of predatory practices. The secret railroad rebates, the use of espionage, the localized price wars to destroy competitors, and the creation of the holding company itself. The defense, led by its fiercely loyal legal team, was equally sophisticated. They argued two main points. Not guilty of unreasonable restraint. They contended that the Sherman Act was being misinterpreted. They claimed Standard Oil's practices, while tough, were simply superior business efficiency. They argued that their massive scale had actually benefited consumers by driving down the price of kerosene, the primary oil product of the era, and ensuring a reliable, consistent supply across the country. Rockefeller himself genuinely believed that the competitive chaos of the independent oil fields was wasteful and inefficient, and his company was a virtuous force bringing order to the industry. Statute of limitations. They argued that many of the events described by Tarbell and cited by the government, like the formation of the infamous South Improvement Company, had occurred decades ago and were irrelevant to the current legal structure of the New Jersey Holding Company. The initial court proceedings involved mountains of testimony and documents. Ida Tarbell's name and her book were constantly referenced, though she was not an official party to the suit. The government's prosecutors essentially built their case upon her meticulously researched chronological narrative of corporate crime. The Circuit Court decision. In 1909, the Circuit Court sided emphatically with the government. The court found that Standard Oil's combination was in fact an unreasonable restraint of trade. The judge condemned the trust's history of ruthlessness, concluding that its success was inextricably linked to illegal and unfair practices designed solely to eliminate competition. The court ordered the immediate dissolution of the trust. Standard Oil, confident in its legal muscle and ability to appeal, immediately took the case to the highest court in the land, the Supreme Court of the United States. 3. The Supreme Court and the Rule of Reason. The case reached the Supreme Court under the new administration of President William Howard Taft, Roosevelt's successor, who continued the trust-busting efforts. The stakes were immense. A ruling against Standard Oil would not just end one company's dominance, it would redefine the scope of federal power over private industry for the entire 20th century. The arguments before the Supreme Court focused heavily on the meaning of the Sherman Act, specifically its key phrase prohibiting every contract combination in the form of trust or otherwise, or conspiracy in restraint of trade or commerce. The majority opinion. Chief Justice White and the Rule of Reason. On May 15, 1911, the Supreme Court delivered its landmark verdict. The decision, written by Chief Justice Edward Douglas White, was a resounding victory for the government. The court upheld the Circuit Court's finding. The Standard Oil Company of New Jersey was a monopoly operating in violation of the Sherman Act. However, the ruling introduced a critical and lasting legal principle, the rule of reason. The interpretation. Chief Justice White reasoned that the Sherman Act could possibly not mean that every contract, combination in the form of trust or otherwise, was illegal. If that were the case, every merger, every business partnership, every corporation that grew large through legitimate means would be illegal. The standard. Instead, the court ruled that the Sherman Act only prohibited combinations that were undue or unreasonable restraints of trade. It created a standard where courts had to examine the intent and effect of a business practice. Was the company merely large and efficient, or did it use its size to predatory ends? The court found that Standard Oil's entire history, its secret rebates, its forced acquisitions, its intent to dominate the market through the use of the holding company, clearly fell under the definition of an unreasonable restraint. The final order. Dismemberment. The Supreme Court's final decree was simple and devastating. The Standard Oil Company of New Jersey must, within 6 months, divest itself of all its subsidiary companies. This meant the central holding company had to relinquish its controlling stock in the 34 major operating companies it owned. These 34 separate entities, the holding company plus the 34 subsidiaries, would become completely independent competing oil companies. The effect was instantaneous. The vast monolith of Standard Oil was fractured into many competing pieces. Among the most famous of these independent companies created by the decree were Standard Oil Company of New Jersey, later Exxon; Standard Oil Company of New York, later Mobil; Standard Oil Company of California, later Chevron; Standard Oil Company of Indiana, later Amoco, which was acquired by BP. The aftermath: Rockefeller's paradoxical win. While the dissolution was the greatest legal defeat in American corporate history, the financial outcome was a paradox. Rockefeller, who had already retired from active management years before, owned a proportional share in stock in all 34 separate companies. Once independent, these new companies were suddenly competing aggressively, which often spurred innovation and efficiency. The collective value of the stock in the 34 smaller companies soon surpassed the value of the monolithic Standard Oil stock. Rockefeller, the man who had been legally deemed a monopolist and whose company was broken up by the government, saw his personal fortune soar immediately following the 1911 decree. He became even richer, the first true billionaire in American history. However, the legal victory was not about personal wealth. It was about the precedent. Ida Tarbell's exposure and the Supreme Court's decision cemented 2 fundamental facts. No corporation, no matter how powerful, is above the law. The rule of reason became the guiding principle of American antitrust law, shaping the government's approach to monopolies for the next century, preventing the formation of other industrial supermonopolies.
Part 3. The Legacy of the Muckraker. The day the Supreme Court announced the dissolution order in 1911, John D. Rockefeller was playing golf in Lakewood, New Jersey. When his associate, John Archbold, rushed up with the grim news, Rockefeller merely paused to swing, listened calmly, and remarked, "That was to be expected. It will not hurt us very much." His prediction, as noted in Part 2, proved financially correct for his personal fortune. But for Ida Tarbell, the verdict was far more profound than mere wealth. It was the absolute validation of her work, and more broadly, the validation of investigative journalism as a necessary 4th pillar of American democracy. The triumph of the pen. Ida Tarbell never became wealthy from her landmark achievement, nor did she seek power. Her triumph was moral and historical. By meticulously detailing the mechanisms of corporate deceit and political influence, she had effectively translated complex economic injustice into a compelling narrative that the average American understood. She made people realize that the invisible hand of the market was sometimes controlled by a greedy, hidden fist. The success of her history series and the subsequent legal victory cemented the era of muckraking, a term originally intended as an insult by President Roosevelt, but adopted as a badge of honor by journalists like Tarbell, Lincoln Steffens, who exposed municipal corruption, and Upton Sinclair, who exposed the meatpacking industry. Tarbell was the undisputed intellectual leader of this group, proving that facts, not sensationalism, were the most potent weapons against entrenched power. Her achievement was particularly significant in the context of her time. As a woman operating in the overwhelmingly male world of industrial finance and national politics, she had achieved what no man in power had dared or managed to do. She shattered the myth of the robber baron as a benevolent genius, presenting Rockefeller as a brilliant yet deeply flawed opportunist whose methods were predatory, not patriotic. An evolving philosophy, the true cost of efficiency. Following the 1911 decision, Tarbell's career took an interesting turn.
Having successfully brought down the greatest trust, she spent the next several decades grappling with a complex question. What is the proper role of the corporation in modern American life? She was not an enemy of big business per se. She never advocated for socialism or the complete destruction of large companies. Instead, her work became more nuanced. She recognized that Standard Oil had brought efficiencies. It eliminated waste, standardized product quality, and drove down the price of kerosene, making light accessible to millions of poor families. Her later writings moved toward examining management ethics and the importance of humanizing industrial life. She came to believe that the core problem with the early trusts was not merely their size, but the arrogance of secrecy and the denial of human responsibility. She argued that corporations should be led by a sense of trusteeship, a responsibility to the community, the worker, and the consumer, not just the shareholder. In the 1920s and 1930s, she wrote biographies of industrial leaders like Elbert H. Gary of U.S. Steel, attempting to find examples of industrialists who balanced efficiency with ethics. She sought to redefine the American capitalist hero, not as the ruthless conqueror, but as the responsible steward. The enduring legal impact. The most lasting and measurable legacy of the Standard Oil case, driven by Tarbell's evidence, was the establishment of the rule of reason. As defined by the Supreme Court, the rule of reason meant that mere size or success was not illegal. What was illegal was the unreasonable restraint of trade, the use of predatory intent and action, like secret rebates and local price dumping, to achieve and maintain dominance. This precedent became the cornerstone of all subsequent antitrust enforcement in the United States, influencing major cases such as the breakup of AT&T in the 1980s and the landmark case against Microsoft in the 1990s. The principles laid down in 1911, the necessity of evaluating a company's conduct rather than just its size, remain the bedrock of the American free market system. Ida Tarbell lived until 1944, witnessing 2 world wars, the Great Depression, and the rise of the New Deal, which was itself heavily influenced by the progressive ideals she championed. She was recognized as the woman who, armed with just a pen, forced the most powerful corporation and the richest man in the world to acknowledge that accountability is the price of immense power. Her life was proof that the historian and the journalist, by digging deep into the facts, could exert a fundamental, structural change on the political economy of the nation.
Part 4. The Modern Echo, The New Titans. The story of Ida Tarbell and John D. Rockefeller is not merely a historical footnote, it is a profound lesson in the cyclical nature of American capitalism and the eternal tension between innovation and control. The legal hammer wielded in 1911, the rule of reason, remains the central, often controversial tool in the American government's arsenal. Today, over a century after the Standard Oil dissolution, the nation faces a new generation of industrial colossi, the massive technology companies, often referred to collectively as the big tech firms, whose control over digital commerce, communication, and information rivals or even surpasses the dominance Rockefeller held over oil. The digital monopolies. The new titans, companies controlling search, social networking, cloud computing, and e-commerce, have built their empires using modern equivalents of Rockefeller's classic tactics. Vertical integration and control. Just as Standard Oil owned the wells, the refineries, and the distribution pipelines, modern tech giants integrate every step of the digital supply chain. They often own the platform, the marketplace, the operating system, the software infrastructure, and the applications, the services that compete on those platforms. This creates an unfair, self-preferential environment, reminiscent of Standard Oil's control over the railroads and pipelines. Predatory pricing and acquisition.
Rockefeller used localized price wars to bankrupt rivals. Today's giants employ kill zone acquisitions, buying promising startups that threaten their core business, often before they can ever truly compete. They also offer services for free, paid for by data harvesting and advertising revenue, which small, competitive firms cannot possibly match, effectively driving out competition. Data as the new oil. Rockefeller monopolized the substance that generated light and movement. The new titans monopolized data, the critical resource that fuels the modern economy. Their sheer scale allows them to gather and process more data than any competitor, giving them an insurmountable advantage in developing AI, targeted advertising, and superior market predictions. The ability to collect and use this data is the ultimate form of information asymmetry, a digital equivalent of Rockefeller's secret railway waybills. The antitrust debate today. The application of the rule of reason to these new complex digital structures is the defining legal challenge of the 21st century. The defense of consumer welfare. Like Standard Oil's lawyers, big tech's defenders argue that their dominance is beneficial to consumers. They point to the fact that their services are often free, efficient, and constantly improving, the digital equivalent of Rockefeller lowering the price of kerosene. They argue that antitrust action would only stifle innovation. The New Brandeis Movement, a modern antitrust philosophy, sometimes called the New Brandeis Movement, after Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis, a contemporary of Tarbell and a famed critic of big business, argues that the courts have become too fixated on consumer prices as the only measure of monopoly harm. They echo Ida Tarbell's original complaint. The true harm of a monopoly is not just high prices, but the destruction of innovation, the corrosion of democracy through undue political influence, and the unfair stifling of opportunity for independent entrepreneurs. Tarbell's meticulous documentation of conduct, the intent to destroy competition, regardless of the immediate effect on prices, has become central to current legal and legislative debates. Modern regulators are returning to her questions. Is this massive power the result of fair competition, or is it the result of unfair practices that violate the spirit of the Sherman Act? The ultimate fate of the new titans, whether they will be broken up like Standard Oil, subjected to new forms of regulation, or simply allowed to continue growing under the existing rule of reason, remains undecided. The answer will determine whether the spirit of competitive enterprise, championed by Ida Tarbell in her tiny Pennsylvania oil town, continues to thrive in the digital age. The astonishment of Tarbell's time, that one man could control 90% of a vital industry, is mirrored by the astonishment of our own time, where a few CEOs control the platforms that mediate global communication, commerce, and knowledge. Tarbell's legacy is the enduring reminder that the power of the pen, driven by verifiable truth and a commitment to competitive justice, is the essential counterbalance to the concentration of colossal wealth.
Part 5. Epilogue. A Life Measured by Principle. Ida Tarbell lived for more than 3 decades after the monumental dissolution of Standard Oil in 1911. Yet the fame she earned from that 5-year magazine series was the axis upon which the rest of her long life turned. She was forever known as the woman who fought John D. Rockefeller and won, a title she carried with a quiet, analytical dignity. After the frenzy of the muckraking era subsided, Tarbell turned her considerable intellect and rigorous research skills toward what she saw as the next great American puzzle, industrial harmony. She wasn't content to merely tear down. She wanted to help rebuild. She spent years traveling across the country, visiting factories and steel mills, interviewing executives, and most importantly, listening to workers. She served on several presidential commissions, including Woodrow Wilson's Industrial Conference, working to mediate disputes between labor and management. She sought to find a middle ground between the ruthless profit motive of the early trusts and the radical demands of labor unions. Her philosophy solidified. The corporation was a social institution, not merely a financial tool. She remained deeply skeptical of unchecked power, whether in the hands of a single tycoon or a monolithic union boss. She continued to write prolifically, authoring biographies, essays on women's rights, though she was famously ambivalent about suffrage, arguing that women should focus on political and social reforms they could effect without the ballot, and thoughtful critiques of American life. In her later years, living on her quiet farm in Connecticut, Tarbell occasionally reflected on the man she had effectively defined for history. When she published her autobiography, All in the Day's Work, in 1939, she admitted that her relationship with Rockefeller was more complex than a simple hero-villain dynamic. She recognized his genuine organizational genius and his deep, albeit religiously misguided, belief that his system eliminated wasteful competition for the greater good. She never hated the man. She hated the system he engineered. When John D. Rockefeller died in 1937, at the age of 97, he was perhaps the most complex figure in American history, both the subject of Ida Tarbell's scathing exposé and the nation's greatest philanthropist, whose foundation funded education, medicine, and science on a massive global scale. Tarbell, by then in her 80s, witnessed this paradox firsthand. She had exposed the source of the wealth as corrupted, but the wealth itself was now fueling unprecedented social good. She left it to history to decide the final balance, understanding that her job had been to force the truth into the public eye, not to issue the final moral judgment. The Rock of Truth. Ida Tarbell died in 1944, having lived through the birth of the oil industry, the Gilded Age, the Progressive Era, and the rise of the New Deal. Her most profound achievement was not the breakup of a company, but the institutionalization of accountability for American capitalism. She taught the nation three vital lessons: the importance of facts, that truth, when meticulously researched and documented, can pierce the thickest layers of corporate secrecy and political corruption; the necessity of the press, that an independent, courageous, and financially supported press is essential for checking power that exists outside of democratic control; the social contract, that size and efficiency do not grant moral license. The privilege of operating in the American marketplace comes with a non-negotiable obligation to abide by the principles of fairness and law. Her legacy endures every time a journalist uses a spreadsheet to expose financial misconduct, every time a small business challenges a corporate giant in court, and every time the government invokes the Sherman Act. She was not a lawyer, a politician, or a tycoon, but a writer who redefined the role of all three. Ida Tarbell's story remains the definitive account of how America learned to govern the engine of its own ambition.